Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining me. I'll just give everybody a few moments to come in and get their audio set up, get their coffee, get their cup of tea wherever you're from. So a good morning and a good afternoon, a good evening to where you're from. Myself am in not so sunny Copenhagen, Denmark right now. My name is Tim Ward. I'll be your presenter today for this webinar. Just a little bit of background on myself as everybody comes in. My background is software engineering. I've been in the engineering space for around the last, I guess I would say, for the last 13, 14 years. And for the last 6 years, I've been focusing in the kind of data space area. You can always reach out to me if you want. I've got my email address there, and I'm sure that the guys organizing the meeting will also share my details. And of course, these slides will be available after the webinar as well. My main goal for today is to really, achieve one goal. It's to show you how we have seen companies, majority of those companies being large enterprises, how have we, seen them become more data-driven, get more value out of their data? And I guess the key questions I'm really trying to get over in this particular session is, what's involved in doing that? Whether it's for yourself or maybe it's for something you're building, and maybe it's for a particular company that you're working at currently. And I think the other thing that we really need to start asking as well is, why? Why should we even do this? What does it look like to become data-driven? So let's head in. So I think to just set the scene, you could probably imagine that, a lot of businesses are the same. And I can say that working with some of the largest enterprise businesses across the globe for the last 5-6 years, that every business seems to have this common issue that data is spread absolutely everywhere within the business. This is typically in between different kind of tools and silos of systems. And the fact that this data is scattered across the business kind of makes it hard to actually start utilizing this data. And in some cases, some of these systems are of such legacy nature. They're to some degree, they've been around in the business for so long that it makes it quite hard to actually enable these platforms to kind of reach some of the more modern requirements that businesses are asking for today. And if you're like me, if you've ever kind of worked in an enterprise before in a big company, and you go to start to use some of these systems for managing customers or maybe products, or maybe you're managing documents or tasks, projects. This kind of reaction where when I search for someone, I actually find, 5, 10, 15 different versions of the same data. So, just looking up my name in a CRM system or a customer relationship system, you start to see, well, that makes it very hard to work with data, because essentially I've got the same person, but just spread over different email addresses. So this is the kind of classic dirty data that we will often see at big businesses. When we walk into a big company today and we analyze what they need to become much more data-driven businesses, this is kind of the components that are kind of commonly seen within most enterprises. Now, it's not a surprise that most big businesses these days have platforms like data warehouses and backup and recovery stories. Maybe they're running in the cloud. Maybe they're working in the finance industry, so they have to actually run a lot of their infrastructure on their own premises. But all of these different components also add to the overall complexity. You could probably start to see how overwhelming this space actually is when it comes to helping a company become data-driven. Now, the interesting part about the situation is that if you ask the people on the business side in these large companies today, what do they want to do to become data-driven? The answer is quite common and quite simple. They want access to good, clean, governed, ready to use data that sits across their business, and they want to start to get value out of that data. And typically the kind of places where we see companies becoming more data driven is in classic business intelligence tools and reporting, and of course the new wave of machine learning and advanced analytics. This is really where the places where most companies have the ability to gain value with their data. But unfortunately, you can see really the complexity that is involved for these large companies to get to that position. Now, when we went through, and in Europe, we started to put out a survey of the top 100 businesses within the Scandinavian area, one of the kind of obvious patterns that showed in the survey data was that the time that was spent in companies getting value out of data was typically broken up into three major stages. And the first, and around 20% of the time, was spent in what is called this organizational effort. So that's figuring out, what data do you have available throughout the business? Where is it? What system has that data? Who is the owner of that system? Who's responsible for that system? What's the security around that? Can I actually use that data for my particular use case? But a majority of the time was spent in what's called this data preparation phase. And this encapsulates quite a lot of stages. But if you look at a lot of the market analysts that look after the data management field, a lot of them are all concurring that around 60 to 80% of the time that is spent on getting value out of data is in this particular phase, data preparation. We'll be exploring that a little bit throughout this presentation as well. Now, of course, the irony being that the business use case, i.e. the thing that we're actually wanting to do with this data, and through this survey, we found that only about 10 to 12% of the time is actually spent on proving some type of business case with this data. So obviously this is a little bit out of what it should be. So really, where we need to push companies to become data driven, it's unrealistic that phase 2 and phase 3, data preparation and organizational effort, it's unrealistic that these pieces will go away. There will always be a kind of a manual component to this. But really, we're wanting to spend so much more time in the business use case itself. So this is the place, or this is the time where we actually get to answer questions. This is where we get to prove hypotheses that we have. Maybe some of these are around business decisions that we would like to make. Maybe it's about knowing more about our customers. Maybe it's knowing more about what our customers will do in the future. So this is really where data-driven businesses have started to move, much more time to spend on the business use cases. So what do we need to do? Well, I guess from a high level, what we need to move to is removing the complexity that is a data landscape. So removing all of those components that, in a way, are necessary to become data-driven, but it's not necessary for the business to actually know that those subsystems exist. And just to remind you, these are components like the data warehouse and data cataloging and data privacy, data compliance. Obviously, this is quite a large thing in Europe and has recently taken on a large piece of the data privacy story in the US as well, in places like California. So really what we need to move towards is not thinking about our technology stack as this complex weave of many different components, but rather we need to think of it as one thing, the data fabric. So the data fabric is a way for us to describe or to push the complexity below a certain abstraction level. After all, that's what we've done in technology for the end of time. Think about things like databases. It's not often that I have to decide between, what are the different components of a database. I go out and I buy a database because it's a abstract abstracted away problem. And the same type of thing will need and does happen when you become a data-driven business. So there's always a hurdle. And what are those hurdles? My plan is to really take you through what's necessary to become a data-driven business and what are some of the complexities that you will run into if you start building this yourself internally, or you're building this maybe in a product that you're innovating on, or maybe you're building this for where you're working. So the first hurdle with anything to do with data is data integration. That's always the first step. I need to get data from somewhere. And I guess the sad part and the part that's really overlooked is that often integration is seen as something that's easy. And this oversight often leads to not giving the right attention to this particular phase and becoming data-driven. I can say after working with large banks and large financial companies and insurance companies that data integration in fact is immensely underestimated in complexity. And I want to give you just a couple of examples of what I mean. So the first would be security. So obviously, if we need to do things with data, we need to be able to source this data from these dispersed systems that are everywhere within our business. This could be within customer systems, this could be within software as a service solutions, this could be something that's custom built in-house. And the first thing we really need to think about is what's called authentication. So how are we going to authorize ourselves to know that we can talk to those different systems and that we're only integrating the data that we actually have permission to see? So what you find actually in the enterprise is that there are different departments that are responsible for data. There are different departments that are responsible for security. And of course, we're innovating in the data department, but the security department is also innovating. So we really need to be able to have an integration story that allows us to adapt to the fact that, these types of authentication mechanisms will always change. There will always be new industry standards. There will always be better security that businesses should be running on. Now, it's so important if we're going to keep a consistent, a robust flow of data throughout the business, we need to make sure that we have a story that allows us to handle this type of turmoil that could happen with authentication and security. The next thing is when you're in the enterprise and you're wanting to work with data, it's typical that you're not working with one person's account. You don't, connect to a particular data source with John Smith's email address or Sarah's username and password. It's typically that you'll be using these things called system accounts or service accounts. And the reason why that's so important is because, you can obviously imagine if you have a company that has 100,000 employees in it, well, tomorrow there might be 90,000. The next day there might be 5,000 new employees. And obviously we need to be able to build an integration story that allows us to adapt to the fact that certain accounts for data might be here today and not tomorrow. So I need to be able to discover accounts that exist in sources, to be able to iterate or enumerate over the accounts that are available to me at that particular point in time. And this will always change. So the key is adaptability. It's so important in the integration piece that we can, provide an ability to adapt to the constant change that is the enterprise. Now, one of the ironic things about data integration and the influx of data that is a majority flooding most of the enterprise businesses is that things need to be more real time. They need to be faster. We're dealing with more data. Now, the irony of the situation here is that means that we need to be able to provide a story where we can integrate data fast, but not too fast. So let me paint the picture for you. A lot of the times when we're integrating data, we're connecting to live systems, production systems. This might be an online service like Office 365 or the Google Suite. Now, a lot of these tools, they have built-in mechanisms to throttle. And what that essentially means is that you can't just sit there and pull data from these services all day, every day. You have to be careful about how often you actually pull data from these services. And this is one of the things that's often overlooked in the enterprise as well. You can imagine that if we're pulling data from a production system, that we would not want to in any way to affect the performance of that system by the fact that we're ingesting data as fast as we humanly can. So it's one of the ironic pieces of data integration, some of the irony in the requests that are coming from the business to be as real time as humanly possible, but I still need my systems to all operate as normally. It makes the situation even more complex. So then a question comes up around data. Well, should we talk about real-time data or should we talk about scheduling of data? And the key difference is this. Do we want to, see data from the different data sources as soon as they get created or modified or deleted? Or are we okay with waiting an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to get a sync of those source systems? And the bottom line is you need both. You need both because a lot of these real-time systems are based off this idea of fire and forget, which essentially means, hey, I'm going to send some data to another system and it either gets there or it doesn't. That's not my responsibility. And there's no type of, handshake or receipt that is given back to that source system to say, hey, thanks for that real-time data, I got it. And because of this, you might be surprised of, even in the enterprise, how fragile these networks and infrastructure pieces are. I mean, there are many times where there's downtime as we upgrade systems. You can imagine if we have real-time data that's being pushed to that system, that entire time while it's down, you're missing that data. And so if we want a full picture, if we want to become data-driven, it's also important that we have a full picture of our data. And that's why it's necessary to kind of combine both of these mechanisms of real-time data and scheduled batches of pulling data from these source systems as well. The second, and to be honest, the biggest hurdle, is preparing this data. So cleaning, standardizing, preparing this data to be used throughout the business. And you could probably imagine that different departments, different parts of the business will want their data to look different. They'll want it to be modeled different. They'll want things to be called different things. So this all adds to the complexity of this stage. Just as a little side note, before we head into the cleaning, one of the kind of interesting things or themes that I've found working in the enterprise space, in the enterprise data space, is a majority of businesses are still, and these are mostly more the legacy businesses, so the businesses that have been around for 40, 50, 60 years, that most of these businesses are still trying to solve all of their data problems with one type of database, the relational database. And the fact is that the relational database is fantastic at solving certain data problems. But the funny thing is, if you look in the market, there are 15 different types of database families that are available to us as engineers, as innovators, as businesses, as companies. And the bottom line is today's data cannot be managed by just one type of database. And so just to give you an example, when we're going out and working with our customers, we actually find that we'll be working with that customer's data in around 5 different database families. Now, all of these database types are targeted at storing, at modeling, and solving different parts of the data problem. So it's really important that we embrace this idea of there is no database, no one database to rule them all. And the more we are able to, I guess, distribute this data across other types of database, the higher flexibility that we can actually offer to the forefront of business when they're wanting to do more with their data. So what are some of the things that businesses are doing in this preparation phase? Well, I think one of the first things that is, if you take away anything from this presentation, I think it's this. It's the ability to score the quality of data that you're working with, to set some type of benchmarks. And this helps in so many facets. It firstly helps that business understand, well, what type of data am I dealing with? What's the quality? What's the accuracy? What's the completeness of those records? How relevant is it to our business? How valid are those records? Are they valid email addresses? Are they valid phone numbers? Is there anything wrong with the formatting of it? And all of these metrics, I won't go into the details of how you measure these, but you can probably start to gather things like, well, if we have records that haven't been either modified or they haven't been audited in a long time, that's relatively stale data. That's a very generic statement to make, but this is, I guess, down to your implementation of how your business would rate staleness. But I think one of the cool factors is that we can't do anything with data if we actually don't set a benchmark of what are we dealing with? What is the quality of data? You might have heard in our space, in data, and I think machine learning was probably the key driver in this, that you don't get good results with bad quality data. Bad quality in, bad quality results out. And this helps us understand what quality we are dealing with. Now, to clean data, there are a lot of things that can actually be automated to clean data, but there are still some very manual steps to this process. We can't just automate everything today. And some of the things I'm talking about would be things like, standardizing the formats of phone numbers, dates. You could probably imagine that different systems will store dates in multiple different formats. The same goes for things like countries. We might use abbreviations like CPH for Copenhagen. We might spell it in Danish. We might have abbreviations that Copenhagen dot. So there's so many permutations that we'll have of these records in the system. And a lot of this can actually be automatically cleaned. But there's lots that actually can't. But we need to go through multiple steps before we get to that stage. Let's try and automate a lot of the cleaning process, or as much as we can. So the next thing that is important, and this becomes more important the more data that you have. You could probably imagine that if you're a small business and that you are ingesting data from just a couple of systems, it's not the worst thing in the world to be able to, say, hey, I need to work with all of the presentations we've ever sent to, Lego. It's not the worst thing in the world if we haven't categorized those presentations as, something like a pitch deck or marketing or sales material. But as your data grows, the ability to categorize and classify the records that you have within your data environment becomes more and more critical. And it's just little things like being able to take the fact that you have a person and classify them as something like a sales lead or a competitor or a champion or a friend or a partner. So this makes it much easier on the other end when we're going to give this data out. We can be much more personal in the way that we share the data. Now, it's at this stage where we have to head into what is probably the most complex piece of data integration, full stop. And that is blending data from different systems. And here's why. I can tell you, after working with literally integrating hundreds of systems, that systems do not and were never designed to blend with other systems beautifully. They were never built in mind to say, hey, if I ever need to blend my data with another data set, I'm going to make that really easy to do. And I'm going to give you a really beautiful ID to be able to kind of merge those different data sources. It doesn't happen. It probably will never happen. It's just one of those things that we have to learn to accept. So bear in mind during your process that if you're looking at becoming data driven, this is one of those critical pieces that you'll have to specify, or at least allot quite a bit of time for. It is by far the most complex piece of the entire story. If you're ever interested in learning more about how we've done it for larger businesses, feel free to reach out to me. I think that's easily enough information for a completely different webinar, so I won't go into that now. Now, if you're like me and you live in Europe, you will know that we have some rather strict data privacy rules. And what this dictates is that if we're storing data, especially personal data, I need to be able to trace where I got that data from, when, who has seen it, who was the creator of that data, where am I using it, and these types of things. So what becomes more and more important is that as you're ingesting this data from different systems, you no longer just need to solve your business use case. You need to be able to store the full audit history, or what's called lineage, of where this data came from and how it matured over time. What did you do to it over time? How have you used it? Did you use it to fuel some reports? Did you do some machine learning with it? You need to be able to prove this lineage. And of course, one thing that we've learned time after time is that often you'll need to go back through history of data to be able to rectify records. The data that we ingest today, we might not have solved all the problems with the data quality. We might have missed some things. It's always nice to be able to go back through time and rectify those types of situations if necessary. It's also at this step that often we see that there's the option of using external data sources to help enrich the data. And time after time, if you're wanting to know more about your customers, if you're wanting to know more about business information, this is where there's a lot of online, some free, some are paid, online data sources where you can actually join onto those systems and help them enrich your internal records. So that is also sometimes a very valid way of being able to become data driven, is actually not only use the data that sits internally within your own environment, but it's something we just can't automate. Data cleaning, data preparation, it still needs to involve people. It still needs to have a human touch. And, to become data driven, if we started to kind of mention some of the roles that are necessary for this, we put, data engineers at work. We make sure that data engineers can help us clean the data. But some of the other things that have become more apparent is that in most businesses today, you'll see more and more roles for what we call data stewards or data curators. And they are people that are very close to the actual data themselves. And I'll give you an interesting example. If we had a record that we wanted to use, and we wanted to kind of use it maybe for something like reporting, and we realized that the person's name was Stefan Anderson, and his first name was spelt with 3 Fs. Now, it's not the role of a business analyst. It's not the role of a data engineer to fix these issues. For all we know, that could be how Stefan spells his name. But it is still important that we clean that data. And hence, what we're seeing more and more is that enterprises are starting to build a culture where they start to involve people in the business in actually playing a role in this curation as well. So just to reiterate, along this way, as you're cleaning records, essentially these metrics of data quality, we'll be moving those up and down depending on how much we were able to automate or manually prepare and clean this data for use cases. So the third hurdle. Let's just say now we have good quality, integrated data with quality control over it. Now we actually want to be able to use it with confidence. So the first hurdle really the third hurdle is data governance. So how do we put a system in place? How does a business put a system in place to make sure that they're actually using their data to all the data privacy acts, they're compliant in their industries, that they're passing all legislations and use of this data? And then it starts to involve a lot of pieces around things like consent mapping. Do you have consent for the data that you have, especially when it comes to personal data? But then we also need to be thinking about things like how long can we keep that data for? Are there any policies on data that we can and can't have? Maybe, for example, if we ever saw data where it was alluding to the sexuality of someone, well, that's something that we should either flag or completely restrict from being used within our business. Now, one of the other things that we've seen as well is that, if we've got good quality data that's governed, that's ready to use, it shouldn't only be the downstream consumers that are benefiting from this. We also need to make sure that we offer a framework that allows us to push this good quality data actually back to the source systems where that data originally came from. After all, it's always hard for big businesses to change, to introduce new tools. And the more that you can keep the business in their current tool set, the better. The less friction you're going to get by introducing this idea of a company becoming data-driven. And as I mentioned before, there are some things that not everyone will immediately know that they can and can't do with data. And I mean, just these data policies from the governance piece allows us to make sure that we can use our data with confidence. It's one of the critical pieces to it. So then when we start to involve the people, which is also, I mean, we often say in our industry, it's people, processes, and technology. That's what makes you data-driven. And so one of the key concepts I'd like to push over is ownership. Ownership, responsibility, accountability. So who owns the data? Who is responsible if it's bad quality? And who's accountable if there is governance policies that are broken with the data that's being used? It's really important that a large business can establish this. And it goes without saying, access control. Who can see what data? It's just one of those givens that I'm sure everyone on the webinar is already well aware of. So I won't focus on it. So the final hurdle is making this data available to the business. So data, it needs to be discoverable. People need to know that this data is available to use. And this is one of the complexities that large businesses often find that they have. And they'll often introduce things like data catalogs, which you could think, just like Amazon or, like your favorite shopping website. It gives you the ability to kind of search throughout your business of what data do we have available for the business to use. But one of the interesting trends we've seen here in Europe with large businesses is to reverse the situation. Instead of different parts of the business asking, I need this data, where do I get it? Then in fact, we can start to push data to where the actual consumption is done. And one of the mechanisms that's getting quite popular today is called streaming. Streaming is the idea of being able to subscribe to certain data that sits within your business. And you could probably understand this is really where companies can start to be data-driven. That it's so easy for me to then say, if the business is requesting, I need all of our customers between this date range that earn over this much annual revenue. The interesting piece is that when I just said that, I didn't mention anything about what tool that data is in. I didn't mention anything about use the data warehouse to get to the data catalog and did you go through the data governance team to see if we can use this? All of this can actually be pushed to the actual consumption point. And where we often see this being the place is obviously tools like reporting tools, business intelligence tools. It might be machine learning and advanced analytics tools as well. So by reversing the situation, what you do is you don't require a business to learn anything new. Those different parts of the business can stay in the tools that they use on a daily basis. And then we can start to, of course, proliferate this business to where the value can actually be gained. So congratulations. With these pillars, you now have a unified, a quality, a clean, a governed access to be able to, proliferate data throughout your business. And really what we end up with, if we follow this path, is this idea of abstracting the complexity away. Now, we have kind of coined this as the data fabric. Think of it as a way of saying, I don't care where the data is, how it's stored, what your backup policies are on it, whether it's in the cloud or not. I just need this data. And, this is really when companies can start to become data-driven. So then to kind of summarize and end the presentation, why even do this? Why even go to, I guess, all the problems and troubles of putting this kind of ecosystem in place? I think one of the key things that we've heard time after time from enterprise companies that have done this is that now your company has a consistent way to utilize data, where the complexity is abstracted away from where the data came from, what did we call it in that system versus another system, and really to offer the flexibility of you can use this data in many flexible ways, whether it's business intelligence, machine learning, or just standard reporting. So then the other key thing is, what does it look like once you are data-driven? So how do you even know that you're data-driven? And one of the analogies or the examples I often like to use is that, for me, data-driven is the ability to be asked by a colleague on a Monday afternoon, I need to know, who are our next customers going to be? Who are the customers that are going to churn? Who are the most likely people to buy us? And I can walk in the next day to a meeting with data that backs me up on my hypothesis of answering those questions. And I have the full confidence that the data that I just used is of high quality, high governance, so I can use it with confidence. So really, it's this kind of utopian idea of data, but it is quite a complex thing to achieve. There's a lot that is involved in becoming a data-driven business. It's not something that happens overnight. But once you do have the kind of, I guess, the pillars of this in place, you can really start to see the value. So just classic examples like being able to build reports, build intelligent reports based off data becomes so much easier. You might be surprised how long it takes businesses to generate simple reports simply because of their scattered nature of their data. Even things like the single view of a customer or the single view of a record. I can tell you for years, this is something that companies have been focused on. How do I know every touch point about our particular person or a particular company that I'm interacting with now? It could be something as simple as being able to search across all your data from a single place. Could be searching for that pitch document where you forgot where it was. Was it in a SharePoint site? Was it in a Dropbox? Was it in my OneDrive? Was it on my local machine? So just the ability to search across that cataloged and clean data becomes valuable. And the example I will end on before I head over to the Q&A section is machine learning. There are many amazing machine learning platforms and tools that are out there on the market. And although they're very good at being able to model sophisticated machine learning techniques, one of the things that they struggle at is getting the data that they need to actually build strong models. So really being data-driven, if you ask yourself that question, what is it? What does it look like? It's really, when I need data, it's something that is frictionless. It's something that I can do very quickly, that I can be very flexible in how I actually get that data as well. So with that in mind, I will just head over to the Q&A section and just check if there is any questions. Fantastic. So I'm just going to read out the question so everyone can hear it, and then see if I can project a proper answer. So the first would be, I am part of a tech startup. How would you start organizing what data I will need for starting for my company in the beginning? So, I mean, CluedIn itself, we obviously started out as a small business. And one of the interesting pieces was, of course, some businesses start off to build a web app or an app for dating, or for, you know, monitoring what food you eat. It was just, I guess, quite fitting that really what we were trying to do was go off and solve the data integration story. So then when it came to starting a business and choosing kind of what data and what tools we actually need to use, I would say we are the worst example of what you should do. And here's why. We went off, we chose different tools for note-taking and mail and tasks, and we had 3 different systems to manage files. We had 3 different coding systems. And really the reason we did that was to also dog food our own product. I mean, we're trying to solve the ability to connect different systems. So in hindsight, if I was doing another type of business, I would say start small. Things don't need to be complex when you're starting out. Keep things simple. There are only, depending on the type of business you are, there's only a limited amount of tools and data that you actually need. And one of the first big things that I would recommend with your data is proper business intelligence and reporting. And that's something that there's a lot of kind of free tools that are available to, you know, things like Kissmetric or Mixpanel or Power BI. There are free versions of all this software to make sure that you get your reporting on tap. So I hope I answered that question. The next question is, as far as databases and your recommendation to use more than one, do you think it is a good idea, a linear array, server 1, server 2, then server 3, 4, or a branch array, 1 to 2, 3, and 4? I'll be honest, I've never heard the terminology linear array and branch array when it comes to, you know, talking about database technology. So I'll apologize for that, but I can probably add, you know, some interesting things around this. And when it comes to databases, obviously, you know, one of the key features is ACID compliance. So the ability to atomically to, you know, atomic and then transactions and so forth. And so the transaction piece is the piece I'd like to focus on there. If you're trying to integrate data across multiple different databases, the idea of a transaction becomes very hard then. Because what happens if you write into database 1, but then database 3 fails? Do you roll back? Do you retry? What happens if you retry 10 times and the database is down? Do you put it onto a separate queue to be able to process later? And actually what we came to in the end was that we use what's called a transaction log, which means we actually only write to one database system. And all of those other 5 databases that we use, they actually just read off this one transaction log. And what you end up with is a database environment that produces something called eventual consistency, where eventually all of the databases will be in sync with each other. So that's how, hopefully that added a little bit of interest to your question. Sorry, I couldn't answer the array part. So the next question is, can you please tell us a little bit more about the child data laws? Yeah, so in Denmark, for example, I mentioned Denmark simply because when it comes to privacy laws, a lot of them can be interpreted differently in different countries. So a child, for example, from the regulation says 13, and in Denmark we have chosen to just comply to that. And so of course, the data laws would be that I'm not allowed to have data on children below the age of 13. Now, then it begs the question, how do you detect that you have data that is from someone that is below 13? And you probably yourself have seen, going to different websites, maybe something like Steam to buy a video game, and it just asks you, how old are you? So there is a responsibility piece there as well. There's the technology piece, which I can sit here and say, all the machine learning in the world will not solve the kind of fact of being able to detect with high confidence that you have a record on a child or not. So it also, there's the kind of, the piece on that, parents have to also be involved in the process of, where the children are sharing the data. And, from the privacy laws here, the way that that would be played out is that a request for that data removal would be pushed to the particular company of choice. And that company would have to, actually fulfill that request within 30 days. So hopefully that added a little bit of information there. So the next question is, with a few bullet points, cornerstone remarks, could you summarize the benefit of using a service like CluedIn over creating in-house tools, or just going with one of the many standard solutions? So I'll answer this question slightly, probably not like you wouldn't expect. The reason why CluedIn exists is because we spent years trying to, I guess, use different products and wire or stitch them together to form a kind of end-to-end data pipeline. And really what we found is that those individual products were fantastic by themselves, but then when we had to have them play with other systems, so let's say we had a good integration piece, but then the cataloging piece or the data warehouse didn't like the integration piece. Maybe the data cleaning and profiling tool, it didn't make it easy for other systems to ingest live data into it. And so we found time after time using these different tool sets, actually the hardest part was stitching them together. So I think one of the approaches that we took as a design with CluedIn was, let's start with the stitching. Let's look at all the different pillars that's needed to build an end-to-end data pipeline. And let's start out with a semi-acceptable integration piece. Let's start out with a rather terrible data catalog, but they work well. They really work well together. And what that allowed us to do is, over time, as our customers said, well, your integration story needs work, we say, great, let's work a little bit on the integration piece this summer, knowing full well that those other pieces that are needed will always play well together. So hopefully that answers the question. I think this next one is a good one. After the Cambridge Analytica scandal, are you seeing that clients are more aware about privacy and what kind of data they are willing to share? Without a doubt. The funny thing is, what happened in Europe around May 2017 through to May 2018, on the 25th of May, when the kind of general the GDPR piece came in, I can tell you that pretty much every single person in the IT industry suddenly became a data privacy expert, or at least became much more aware of the privacy pieces around data. Now, the sad part is that, those privacy acts are so complex to be able to kind of interpret that I'm still sure a lot of practitioners in our area don't still really know how they're supposed to treat data properly. And one of the things I often tell our customers is, since when did data engineers and warehouse engineers and business analysts, since when did it become required that they are also lawyers that understand, data privacy acts and explicitly how to use data in different ways? Now, the education level in privacy is quite high in Europe because of this GDPR piece. But what we kind of think is, well, we know we need to do it. We know we need to have the privacy there on everything that we do with data, especially people data or person data. So why not put that into a layer of your data pipeline that abstracts away that complexity from whoever's supposed to work with that data? It is very apparent that, Cambridge Analytica and, some of the Facebook leaks and eBay and Yahoo and Equifax, all of these leaks are definitely raising the, I guess, how scared some businesses are in actually putting some of these systems into production. So I've got two more questions. The next one is, what are the best resources you would suggest for beginners of a tech startup? Interesting. So, I can relate to this because we are very much a tech startup as well. In fact, still to this date, CluedIn is made up of 90% engineers. I would say some of the key tools that you should really get in place, and this is probably generically for all tech startups. The first would be that, and it's a cliche, but it seems like everybody still falls for it. Building a product or providing a service is a combination of listening to your customers and ignoring them. So if you just listen to your customers, you would never innovate. So it's this weird concoction of talking to your early adopters of customers, knowing full well they will not be your customers in the future. Trying to latch onto people that will give you the time, that will and dedicate quite a lot of time to embrace that type of relationship as well, because that will become critical down the path where you will get the obvious things out of the way that you won't particularly realize yourselves. I would also say, being a tech startup, one of the other pieces I'd like to give is a boring piece, but it is how important cash flow is in a business early on. So most of you will be starting or having a startup that, is running off we would say, an oily rag. So, it's constantly in cash flow types of issues. So up front, just know that will be a problem. And the way to solve this is, if you're doing work for customers, try things like get them to pay up front. Try to get them to subscribe to your product or service a year up front. Of course, put in the effort to make their experience really well, because they are also putting a risk on their side. But getting that cash flow on the finances part up early is, I think, really key to the success of a startup. And then the final question is, how do I understand what is the data I require and where to use them and sort them out? This is a good question. There are two things that I think are necessary to get success in becoming a data-driven business. If you're a large business, you need buy-in from the management level or the C level. Without a doubt, if you are a 1,000-person company, 5,000 and up, if the C level is not on board with getting value out of data and becoming a data-driven business, it won't happen. It will never happen. There will always just be too much friction. So the other piece answers your question here. You need use cases. You need tangible use cases that have measurable KPIs and outputs. Something as simple like, I want to be able to forecast how much money we will bring in on a monthly basis over the next 2 years. That's a use case. Now, when you think about that, the data that you'll need to forecast that, you'll probably need customer data from the CRM system. You'll probably need data from the invoicing system. You might need to connect to your bank to see if those invoices were actually paid. And only then, when you pull them into a kind of, to start to wrangle the data, you might notice, oh, they all use different date formats, so I need to standardize on that. Or they all use different vocabularies around describing price or customer name. Oh, I need to standardize on that. But once you've gone through that process, and I highlighted quite a lot of the kind of pieces on the presentation, that's the kind of data that you want to use to solve your use case. So really, to answer that question, it's so important that you get upfront use cases. What are you actually trying to do? Are you trying to save costs? Are you trying to make more money? Are you trying to innovate in an area that no one else is going to? That there is your use case. And most use cases today in the enterprise can be fueled by data. There is one more question I didn't answer, but I left it till last. Is it, will there be pictures that are visible? I don't really know how to answer that, but hopefully people saw my presentation, and I know that they're sending out the slides after this. So hopefully that answers your question as well. It's going to close the Q&A. And yeah, perfect. Thanks for all the feedback, and I hope I was able to provide some interesting information for you. Feel free to reach out. I'll just repeat my email address if you didn't remember. It was tiw@cluedin.com. Feel free to reach out if you want to see kind of what we do and what customers that we work with and some of the kind of challenges that we've solved for those businesses. Some of them become a little bit wild, especially the larger the business, and really the interesting use cases are often the large financial institutions that have such strict regulation and legislations around how to utilize data. It definitely makes making them or helping them become a data-driven business that much harder. But like one of the questions I was asked, where do you start? Well, when it comes to becoming data-driven, you need to start somewhere, right? And the sooner that you start and the sooner that you pay attention to your business at making sure you have a good data story, I think that the more that you'll benefit as you grow into a larger business. So with that in mind, I think I wish everyone a good morning or day or evening wherever you are. And yeah, thank you very much.